I often get asked about my autism diagnosis journey. Being a late diagnosed autistic person, I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder when I was 23 years old. And there are a lot of factors that went into this life changing moment in my life. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Growing up, I always felt different. I think I would also describe this feeling as feeling like an alien in the world sometimes. I didn't really see myself in my peers. I had a hard time relating to people, and I always felt misunderstood. I was also known as being stubborn and rigid. I was known as being shy and quiet. And it had kind of been joked around with me before that maybe I am on the autism spectrum or maybe I am autistic. But I kind of just pushed those things aside because I didn't really know what autism even was. I had seen a few examples in media and movies and TV shows, but I didn't actually understand what it was, what it looked like, more importantly, how it felt being an autistic person. Through my childhood, I struggled a lot with my mental health. I was constantly anxious. I was always what I know now to be overstimulated. I struggled with depression and suicidality. I went to therapy for a few years to try to work on these things, but I just knew that something else was there and I just didn't really know what it was. And so fast forward some years into adulthood where I still felt like I struggled to fit in. I still felt different. I felt sort of like an outcast. And honestly, I think the main thing that sort of like started this journey for me was watching the Netflix show Love on the Spectrum. It was like the first time in my whole life where I felt like I could relate to the people I was seeing on TV. The things that they described about the things that they felt, the way that they acted, it all just really resonated with me. And I was like, this is really interesting. So that sort of started this whole journey of a suspicion that I could be on the autism spectrum. And I started doing a ton of research on the internet. I read a few books, listened to a lot of podcasts, watched a lot of YouTube videos. I did probably every online autistic assessment I could find, and everything was pointing towards it's likely I could be on the autism spectrum. I didn't want to self-diagnose because I like to know things for a fact, and I like to be 100% certain about things before I sort of accept them as my reality and before sharing it with other people. And so at that point, I decided I think I'm going to see a professional to be assessed for autism. Now, in my area, there are only two doctors who do adult autism assessments. And so one of them I had to wait 1 year. The other one I had to wait 10 months. So I chose the one I had to wait 10 months for. And in that time period between when I scheduled the assessment to when I actually went to go see the doctor, it was a really hard time. I was having a lot of realizations. I was feeling a lot of grief. There were so many things that were clicking, like, oh, that's why I am the way that I am. And I think in order for me to at least sort of like start the healing process, I had to self-diagnose. And that wasn't before I did a ton of research. That wasn't before I spent months pondering and just thinking about this. And so when I self-diagnosed, it was pretty much for me so that I can start looking at ways to help myself, because my whole life I needed this help and I just didn't have it. And now that I have a lot of answers, I can finally start finding ways to support myself better. I found the language to explain my internal experiences that I always felt so confused about. And then it finally came time to see the neuropsychologist to be assessed for autism. And this was a really lengthy and just exhausting process. It consisted of 4 different appointments over a month-long span. She did all kinds of tests. I can't even remember specifically what we did. I was sort of like tunnel visioned when I was in there and just trying to focus on getting through it because it was so exhausting. And after each appointment, my brain was like mush. It literally felt like my brain had melted and I just couldn't think straight for a few days following each appointment of my autism assessment. And so on the last appointment, she went over the results and explained that I have generalized anxiety disorder. She explained that I had periods in my life where I had major depressive disorder. And then she talked about how through her findings, she diagnosed me with autism spectrum disorder level 1, which means that I have lower support needs than other people on the autism spectrum. And one thing that I found really interesting is she did also say that my anxiety is probably related to my autism. And that was kind of like a clicking moment in my head because I had always been such an anxious person all through my childhood, through my teenage years, through my early adulthood. And it just felt like nothing could fix it. And then finally understanding that, oh, I'm anxious because of my autism, that it just explains everything. And I think after the appointment, I felt a lot of relief. I was really curious about what she would say and what she would find through her tests, and it just sort of like validated everything that I had felt about myself. It really validated all these aha moments that I had. And more importantly, it helped me understand myself so that going forward, I can live a life that supports me rather than living a life where I'm constantly trying to keep my head above water. I'm truly so grateful for that diagnosis. And it probably seems weird to someone who doesn't understand, like, why are you grateful to be diagnosed with autism? And it's not that the diagnosis gave me autism. I had been autistic my entire life, not knowing that I was autistic. And this created a whole bunch of problems. But now that I have this explanation, I can live my life going forward with accommodations, with a self-understanding that is unlike any I've felt before.